On a quiet southern morning in 1862, while the American Civil War was tearing the nation apart, a Confederate warship quietly glided out of Charleston Harbor. The guards at Fort Sumter saluted as it passed. They believed they were watching one of their own. They were wrong. By the time the sun rose, that ship and the enslaved black man secretly commanding it had altered the course of American history forever. His name was Robert Smalls, and the United States had never seen anything like him. Part 1. Born in Chains, Raised by the Sea. Robert Smalls was born in April 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina, a coastal town where the Atlantic Ocean breathed salt into every street and slavery ruled every human interaction. His mother, Lydia Polite, was enslaved. His father's identity was never officially recorded, a common silence in the records of bondage. From the moment Robert opened his eyes, the world had already decided his fate. He was property, not a citizen, not a child with a future, not even a person under the law, just another enslaved body owned by another human being. Yet fate, history, and sheer will had other plans. Robert's early childhood unfolded under a system designed to crush curiosity and ambition. Enslaved children were not educated, they were conditioned. They learned obedience before language, fear before hope. But Robert was different. From a young age, he noticed patterns, how tides moved, how ships entered harbor, how white men spoke differently when they believed black people weren't listening. Beaufort was a port town, and ships were its heartbeat. Cargo ships, naval vessels, private boats, Robert watched them all. The harbor was alive with motion, noise, and possibility. When Robert was around 12 years old, his enslaver sent him to Charleston to be heared out. This practice allowed slaveholders to rent enslaved people to others, collecting wages while the enslaved received nothing. Charleston was larger, louder, more dangerous, and far more important to the Confederacy. It was here that Robert Smalls found the sea. Part 2. The Making of a Master Pilot. Charleston Harbor was one of the most complex and heavily guarded ports in America. Sandbars shifted constantly. Shallow channels could wreck a ship in minutes. Navigation required skill, memory, and precision. White captains depended on black labor, especially enslaved sailors, but refused to acknowledge their expertise. Robert began at the bottom, hauling ropes, scrubbing decks, carrying cargo, but he watched everything. He memorized the harbor. He learned signals, tides, and military routines. And slowly, quietly, he became indispensable. By his early 20s, Robert Smalls knew Charleston Harbor better than most white officers who commanded it. Ironically, Confederate captains trusted him with their ship's navigation, yet trusted him so little as a human being that they never imagined he might use that knowledge against them. That arrogance would cost them dearly. Part 3. A Family in the Shadow of War. In 1856, Robert married Hannah Jones, an enslaved hotel maid. Together they had children, still legally owned by others, still vulnerable to sale, punishment, or death. Robert loved his family fiercely, but love under slavery was a dangerous thing. Any attachment could be weaponized. By 1861, war had erupted. The Confederate States of America declared secession, and Charleston became a critical military hub. Robert was assigned to the CSS Planter, a Confederate transport ship armed with cannons and used to deliver troops and supplies. Every night, white officers left the ship and returned to shore, trusting enslaved black crewmen to guard it. Every night, Robert Smalls memorized their routines, and slowly a plan began to form.
Part 4. The Impossible Escape. Robert Smalls did not dream recklessly. He calculated. He studied the Confederate signal codes, specific whistles and flags required to pass forts. He memorized every checkpoint between Charleston and open water. He knew exactly when the guards were tired, careless, predictable. Most importantly, he knew this: if he failed, he would be executed. If he succeeded, he could change everything. On the night of May 12, 1862, Robert Smalls made his move. He gathered the enslaved crew. He had already arranged for their families, including his wife and children, to hide nearby, ready to board. Before dawn, Robert Smalls put on the captain's straw hat and became the captain. Part 5. Stealing a Warship. As the CSS Planter pulled away from the dock, Robert stood tall at the helm. His heart pounded, but his hands did not shake. Fort Johnson, Fort Sumter, each signal delivered perfectly. Confederate guards waved him through. They saw a familiar silhouette. They heard the correct whistles. They never imagined the truth. Once beyond the final fort, Robert raised a white flag and steered directly toward the Union blockade. Union soldiers nearly fired on the ship until they realized what they were seeing. An enslaved man had stolen a Confederate warship and delivered it, fully armed, to the Union Navy, along with vital intelligence and freedom for every soul aboard. Part 6. From Contraband to National Sensation. When the CSS Planter crossed into Union-controlled waters, Robert Smalls did not step onto freedom as a hero. At first, he stepped into uncertainty. Union officers used the word contraband to describe escaped enslaved people. It was a cold, bureaucratic term, human beings reduced to seized property. Even after accomplishing what no white officer had dared to do, Robert Smalls was not immediately recognized as a man of agency. But facts are stubborn things. The Planter carried artillery, it carried ammunition, it carried Confederate codes, maps, and harbor defenses, and it had been delivered without a single Union casualty. Within days, Northern newspapers exploded with the story. An enslaved man had outwitted the Confederacy at its own gates. For many Americans in the North, especially white readers who had never questioned racial hierarchies, the story was deeply unsettling. It challenged a core lie of slavery, that black people were incapable of leadership, strategy, or courage.
Robert Smalls became a symbol, whether the nation was ready for him or not. Part 7. A battle beyond the battlefield. Despite the praise, injustice lingered. Under Union law at the time, prize money from captured enemy vessels was distributed among the crew, but the system did not envision black men receiving equal shares. White officers attempted to reduce Robert Smalls' contribution to mere labor. Smalls refused to stay silent. He testified. He argued. He demanded recognition. Eventually, the federal government awarded him a share of the prize money, an extraordinary acknowledgement in a deeply racist system. With that money, Robert did something revolutionary. He bought his mother's freedom. He reunited his family, and he proved that freedom, once tasted, was not something he would ever relinquish. Part 8. The Man Lincoln Needed. The Civil War dragged on. Casualties mounted. President Abraham Lincoln faced enormous pressure from abolitionists, generals, politicians, and enslaved people themselves. The Union Navy was struggling to recruit sailors in the South. Robert Smalls had an answer. He traveled to Washington, D.C., where he met with government officials and eventually influenced policy that allowed black men to serve in the Union military, not as servants, but as soldiers and sailors. This was not symbolism, it was strategy. Black soldiers knew the terrain, they knew the South, they understood the stakes. Over 180,000 black men would eventually serve in the Union Army and Navy. Their contribution helped decide the war. And Robert Smalls was at the center of that transformation. Part 9. A New War After the War. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was legally abolished, but the war for equality had only begun. The South lay in ruins, physically and psychologically. White supremacists were furious, not just at defeat, but at the idea of formerly enslaved people claiming citizenship. Robert Smalls returned to South Carolina, and he entered politics. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was an act of defiance. A former enslaved man, once considered property, now stood for election in a land that had been built to deny him humanity. He won. Again and again. Part 10. Reconstruction's most dangerous man. As a member of the South Carolina legislature and later the U.S. Congress, Robert Smalls fought for public education, civil rights, and equal access to public transportation. He faced constant threats. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities. Lynchings were common. Assassinations were expected. Smalls carried a gun, not to intimidate, but to survive. He was arrested on false charges. He was smeared in newspapers. He was targeted because he represented something more dangerous than rebellion. He represented permanence. Part 11. The Long Shadow of Betrayal. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction was collapsing. Federal troops withdrew. White supremacist governments reclaimed power across the South. Laws were rewritten. Voting rights erased, segregation legalized. Robert Smalls lived through this transformation. Imagine the psychological toll. A man who had stood in Congress, who had shaped federal law, now watching his people stripped of rights he had helped secure. He did not retreat. He continued organizing. He continued speaking. He continued resisting, quietly when necessary, openly when possible. Resistance was no longer glorious, it was survival. Part 15. The Weight of Being First. History often celebrates firsts, but it rarely examines their cost. Robert Smalls was the first in many ways. One of the first black naval pilots in U.S. service. One of the first formerly enslaved men elected to Congress. One of the first black leaders to challenge segregation publicly. Being first meant being exposed. Every failure would be blamed on his race. Every success would be minimized or questioned. Every act of courage would be framed as luck. Robert Smalls understood this. That is why he was meticulous. That is why he documented everything. That is why he never stopped asserting his humanity. Part 16. The House That Told the Truth. The house where Robert Smalls died carried a quiet irony. It had once belonged to his enslaver. In another era, such symbolism would have been celebrated as a triumph of justice. But in early 20th century America, it was merely tolerated, barely.
Yet the house remained, a physical contradiction to the lie that black Americans had no role in shaping the nation. Part 17. How History Survived Without Him. When Robert Smalls died in 1915, the world was changing rapidly. World War loomed. Industrial America surged forward. New heroes replaced old ones. His death barely made national news. But history has a way of resurfacing truths. Decades later, scholars began digging. Archivists rediscovered documents. Historians noticed anomalies, moments where official narratives didn't align with facts. Who had really piloted the planter?
who had influenced early black military enlistment, who had represented South Carolina in Congress during Reconstruction. The answers kept pointing back to one name: Robert Smalls. Part 18. Why his story still threatens power. Even today, Robert Smalls' story unsettles people because it destroys excuses. It proves that enslaved people were not waiting to be freed. They were planning, resisting, leading. It proves that black leadership is not modern, accidental, or borrowed. It proves that American democracy has always been expanded from below, not generously handed down from above. That is why his story matters now, not as inspiration, but as evidence. Part 19. A mirror from modern America. Look closely at Robert Smalls' life, and you see patterns that still exist. The dismissal of black expertise, the fear of black political power, the rewriting of history to preserve comfort. America has changed, and it has not changed enough. Robert Smalls does not belong to the past alone. He belongs to every debate about citizenship, belonging, and truth. Part 20. The man who refused to stay small. Robert Smalls was born enslaved in a nation that denied his humanity. He stole a warship. He changed military policy. He shaped American law. He survived betrayal. He endured erasure. And still his story lived. Not because the nation honored it, but because truth has weight, and truth eventually resurfaces. Part 21. The lie that replaced him. As the 20th century advanced, America needed a story it could live with. It could not live comfortably with Robert Smalls. Instead, it embraced the lost cause myth, a carefully constructed narrative that portrayed the Confederacy as noble, slavery as secondary, and black Americans as unprepared for freedom. That version of history did not emerge organically. It was written into textbooks, carved into stone monuments, and reinforced by popular culture. In that version of history, enslaved people were loyal, passive, grateful. Freedom came from benevolent white leaders, not from black resistance or intelligence. Robert Smalls shattered that illusion, so he had to disappear. Part 22. Monuments speak louder than truth. Across the South, statues rose, not to the enslaved, not to the liberators, but to Confederate officers who had fought to keep human beings in chains. These monuments were not built immediately after the war. They appeared decades later, during the rise of Jim Crow. They were messages. They told black Americans who truly held power. They told white Americans which past to honor. They told the nation which truths were acceptable. There was no statue for the man who stole the planter. Silence was the monument chosen for him. Part 23. Hollywood's convenient blind spot. When cinema emerged as America's most powerful storyteller, it inherited the same biases. Films like The Birth of a Nation did not just ignore men like Robert Smalls, they actively demonized the idea of black political power. Reconstruction was portrayed as chaos. Black leaders were caricatures or villains. A story about an enslaved man outsmarting the Confederacy, commanding a warship, and reshaping federal policy would have challenged everything Hollywood had been built to normalize. So it was never told, not because it lacked drama, but because it had too much truth. Part 24. What the archives could not erase. Paper remembers what people try to forget. In naval logs, Smalls' name appeared again and again, attached to missions white officers refused to take. In congressional records, his speeches were preserved, calm and precise, arguing for equal access to public services. He spoke without rage.
That may have been his most radical act. He refused the stereotype that power demanded anger. He believed dignity itself was a weapon, and the record shows it terrified his opponents. Part 25. The Price of Moral Clarity. Robert Smalls never became a national celebrity. That was not an accident. America has always been more comfortable celebrating black suffering than black competence. Victims are non-threatening. Strategists are dangerous. Smalls was neither loud nor submissive. He was steady. That steadiness exposed how fragile white supremacy actually was. Part 26. The Civil Rights Movement's Unspoken Ancestor. When the Civil Rights Movement erupted in the mid-20th century, its leaders stood on foundations built by earlier generations, many of whom history had buried. The tactics of legal challenge, moral argument, federal pressure, these were not new. Robert Smalls had used them a century earlier. He believed in America's stated ideals, even when America betrayed them. That belief, paradoxically, made him subversive. Part 27. Why his story resurfaced. Late in the 20th century, something shifted. Scholars questioned old narratives. Communities demanded fuller histories. Black Americans searched for ancestors not just of pain, but of power. Robert Smalls returned, not dramatically, but persistently. Articles appeared. Books followed. Schools quietly added his name. Truth does not return with permission. It pushes. Part 28. What it means to remember correctly. Remembering Robert Smalls is not about replacing one hero with another. It is about correcting the scale. It is about understanding that American freedom was not inevitable. It was fought for by people who were never meant to win. Smalls did not wait for history to include him. He forced it. Part 29. The dangerous simplicity of forgetting. Forgetting Robert Smalls makes injustice feel accidental. Remembering him makes injustice look deliberate. That is the discomfort his story creates. Because if a man born enslaved could navigate warships, negotiate federal power, and articulate constitutional rights, then the barriers placed before black Americans were never about ability. They were about control.
Part 30. The Measure of a Nation. A nation is measured not only by whom it celebrates, but by whom it buries. Robert Smalls was buried quietly. But his life stands as a test America still has not fully passed. Part 31. Patriotism Without Permission. Robert Smalls believed in the United States long before the United States believed in him. This is difficult for modern audiences to understand. He risked his life for a nation that had enslaved him, hunted him, erased him, and then asked him to be patient. His patriotism was not emotional, it was deliberate. He believed the Constitution meant exactly what it said, even when those in power did not. That belief made him dangerous, because it left no room for excuses. Part 32. The Fear of Competence. Throughout American history, black resistance has often been framed as emotional or chaotic. Robert Smalls broke that framing. He was precise. He was calm. He was correct. White supremacists could dismiss anger. They could crush rebellion, but they struggled to counter competence backed by documentation. Smalls did not demand rights by force. He demanded them by law, and that frightened people who relied on ambiguity to maintain power. Part 33. When Democracy Closed Its Doors. As Jim Crow solidified, the promise of Reconstruction evaporated. The Supreme Court upheld segregation. Congress turned inward. The federal government abandoned its responsibility to protect black citizens. Robert Smalls watched the doors close, one by one. Voting rights disappeared. Public equality vanished.
Federal enforcement retreated. It was not sudden. That was the cruelty of it. It happened slowly enough that many pretended it wasn't happening at all. Part 35. What he refused to become. Many men broken by betrayal retreat into bitterness. Smalls did not. He refused to become a cautionary tale about going too far. He refused to apologize for demanding equality. He refused to accept that justice was seasonal. His resistance became quieter, but no less firm. Sometimes survival itself is defiance. Part 36. The Illusion of Progress. By the early 1900s, America congratulated itself on unity. The Civil War was reframed as brother against brother. The cause of slavery faded into the background. Reconciliation mattered more than truth. But reconciliation without justice is not healing. It is anesthesia. Robert Smalls understood that, and he lived long enough to see the cost. Part 37. History's Selective Memory. History often claims to remember winners. That is a lie. It remembers comfort. The story of Robert Smalls is uncomfortable because it demands accountability not just from the South, but from the nation as a whole. He exposes how quickly ideals are abandoned when they inconvenience power. Part 38. The Erasure That Failed. Erasure works only when no evidence remains, but Robert Smalls left too much behind. Ships, speeches, votes, records. Each one contradicted the story America told itself, and contradictions eventually demand resolution. Part 39. The Question His Life Asks. Robert Smalls does not ask whether America is capable of greatness. He asks whether America is willing to be honest, because honesty requires acknowledging that freedom has always been contested and that those denied it have always fought back with intelligence, courage, and strategy. Part 40. The Story That Refuses to End. This is not a story about the past. It is a story about what happens when truth is delayed but not destroyed. Robert Smalls did not disappear. He was postponed, and every generation that rediscovers him inherits a responsibility. Part 41. America's Unfinished Sentence. Every nation tells a story about itself. America's story often pauses at moments of discomfort, then resumes as if nothing essential was lost. Robert Smalls exists in that pause, the space between what America claims to be and what it has repeatedly done. He exposes the unfinished sentence at the heart of American democracy. Freedom declared, equality postponed, justice conditional. Smalls lived inside that contradiction and refused to normalize it. Part 42. The Cost of Waiting. History often praises patience. Robert Smalls never did. He understood that waiting for people denied power is rarely neutral. It benefits those already comfortable. When enslaved people waited, they were sold. When freed people waited, they were disenfranchised. When citizens waited, their rights were quietly rewritten. Smalls did not wait for permission. That urgency is part of why he unsettled so many. Part 43. Competence as Resistance. The most radical thing Robert Smalls ever did was not stealing a ship. It was mastering systems designed to exclude him: navigation, law, politics, military strategy. He did not reject institutions outright. He exposed their hypocrisy by operating within them more effectively than those who claimed ownership. That kind of resistance leaves no easy enemy. Part 44. Why he was never safe. Power does not fear desperation. It fears legitimacy. Robert Smalls had legitimacy, earned, documented, undeniable. He could not be dismissed as an outsider or extremist. He was what America said it valued: disciplined, intelligent, patriotic. That made him threatening long after the war ended, because if he belonged, exclusion had no moral defense. Part 45. The Generational Gap. By the time the next generation came of age, Robert Smalls's name had faded, but the conditions he fought remained. Black Americans inherited the consequences without the context. Segregation felt permanent. Disenfranchisement felt inevitable. History felt closed. That was the danger of erasure. Part 46. Rediscovery is not redemption. When a nation rediscovers a forgotten figure, it often treats remembrance as resolution. But remembering Robert Smalls does not absolve America. It indicts it. It raises questions that cannot be answered with plaques or holidays. Why was his vision abandoned? Who benefited from that abandonment? Why did it take so long to acknowledge him?
Part 47. The pattern repeats. Robert Small's life reveals a recurring American pattern. Crisis creates opportunity. Progress is made. Power feels threatened. Progress is rolled back. Memory is erased. Understanding this pattern is more important than celebrating any single victory, because without memory, the cycle resets. Part 48. The burden of truth. Truth is heavy. It requires institutions to admit failure. It requires beneficiaries of injustice to confront inheritance. It requires myths to be dismantled. Robert Smalls carries that weight simply by existing in the record. That is why his story still resists simplification. Part 49. What he would recognize today. If Robert Smalls walked through modern America, much would look unfamiliar, but some things would be painfully recognizable. Debates over citizenship, fear of black political power, selective readings of history, calls for patience instead of justice. He would understand the language. He had heard it before. Part 50. A measure of courage. Robert Smalls's courage was not reckless. It was sustained. He acted when action was deadly. He spoke when silence was safer. He persisted when recognition disappeared. That is a harder form of bravery, and it is the kind most easily forgotten. Part 51. Loyalty without illusion. Robert Smalls never confused loyalty with blindness. He loved a country that repeatedly failed him, but he never pretended it had earned that love. His loyalty was conditional, not on race or tradition, but on principle. He believed allegiance was not owed to a flag alone, but to the ideals the flag claimed to represent. That distinction made him inconvenient, because it meant patriotism could be measured and found lacking. Part 52. The silence that followed courage. After his political career faded, Robert Smalls did not vanish from life. He vanished from conversation. Silence replaced confrontation. That silence was strategic. It allowed America to avoid the discomfort of unfinished justice while still celebrating abstract freedom. Smalls became a footnote when he was mentioned at all, and footnotes rarely inspire accountability. Part 53. What comfort requires. Comfort requires forgetting details. It requires smoothing sharp edges. It requires heroes without demands. It requires stories that end neatly. Robert Smalls's life refused to cooperate. There was no tidy resolution, no triumphant reconciliation, no moment where equality arrived and stayed. Only effort, only resistance,
only persistence against retreat. That made him difficult to package and easy to ignore. Part 54. The Inheritance of Delay. Delay has consequences. Every right postponed becomes a grievance inherited. Every promise deferred becomes a burden passed forward. Smalls understood this instinctively. That is why he fought so hard during Reconstruction. He knew windows close. When Reconstruction collapsed, he knew the cost would not be paid by his generation alone. History proved him right. Part 55. Why his story is still radical. Robert Smalls does not belong neatly to any ideology. He believed in federal power and local accountability. He believed in law and moral urgency. He believed in patience and action. This complexity resists slogans, and stories that resist slogans rarely go viral until their absence becomes impossible to ignore. Part 56. Memory as a battleground. Memory is not neutral, it is curated. The exclusion of Robert Smalls was not simply neglect, it was a choice repeated across generations because it served stability built on inequality. Remembering him now disrupts that stability. That is why memory becomes a battleground long after wars end. Part 57. The Evidence that Endures. Ships rot, buildings fall, statues crack, but records endure. Smalls' handwriting in official documents, his name in congressional rolls, his actions in naval logs. These are not interpretations, they are facts, and facts are difficult to erase forever. Part 58. What he never asked for. Robert Smalls never asked to be exceptional. He asked to be equal. Exceptionalism was imposed on him by a system that denied basic rights and then marveled when he overcame that denial. His life challenges the idea that greatness is rare. Sometimes greatness is simply what competence looks like under pressure. Part 59. The Quiet Continuation. After Smalls, others followed, often not knowingly. Black leaders who believed in institutions, even when institutions betrayed them. Activists who used law as both shield and weapon. Citizens who demanded inclusion rather than separation. They inherited methods, even if they did not inherit names. That is how legacy often works. Part 60. The Uncomfortable Question. Robert Smalls' life leaves one question unresolved. If America knew then what it claims to know now, why did it wait so long to act? That question has no historical boundary. It applies to every generation that benefits from delay while promising eventual justice. Part 71. Selective Patriotism. Selective patriotism praises sacrifice only when it reinforces comfort. Robert Smalls disrupted that comfort. He did everything patriotism claimed to honor, risked his life, defended the nation, upheld its laws. Yet his loyalty was never fully embraced, because his patriotism demanded reciprocity. He asked the nation to live up to its promises, and selective patriotism has no answer to that demand. Part 72. Education as a Gatekeeper. What a nation teaches determines what it tolerates. By excluding Robert Smalls from mainstream education, America narrowed the imagination of what black citizenship could look like. Leadership became an exception. Governance became suspicious. Authority became conditional. Ignorance did not merely forget Smalls, it prepared the ground for future exclusion. Part 73. The Danger of a Complete Story. An incomplete history is easy to defend. A complete one is not. Robert Smalls forces the inclusion of uncomfortable facts: that enslaved people understood power, that they mastered complex systems, that they were denied rights not because of incapacity, but because of threat. A complete story destabilizes hierarchy. That is why it is resisted. Part 74. Why time did not heal this wound. Time heals wounds only when wounds are treated. Robert Smalls's erasure was never addressed, it was layered over. Generation after generation inherited silence, mistaking distance for resolution. Distance only buried the evidence, it did not erase it.
Part 47. The pattern repeats. Robert Small's life reveals a recurring American pattern. Crisis creates opportunity. Progress is made. Power feels threatened. Progress is rolled back. Memory is erased. Understanding this pattern is more important than celebrating any single victory, because without memory, the cycle resets. Part 48. The burden of truth. Truth is heavy. It requires institutions to admit failure. It requires beneficiaries of injustice to confront inheritance. It requires myths to be dismantled. Robert Smalls carries that weight simply by existing in the record. That is why his story still resists simplification. Part 49. What he would recognize today. If Robert Smalls walked through modern America, much would look unfamiliar, but some things would be painfully recognizable. Debates over citizenship, fear of black political power, selective readings of history, calls for patience instead of justice. He would understand the language. He had heard it before. Part 50. A measure of courage. Robert Smalls's courage was not reckless, it was sustained. He acted when action was deadly. He spoke when silence was safer. He persisted when recognition disappeared. That is a harder form of bravery, and it is the kind most easily forgotten. Part 51. Loyalty without illusion. Robert Smalls never confused loyalty with blindness. He loved a country that repeatedly failed him, but he never pretended it had earned that love. His loyalty was conditional, not on race or tradition, but on principle. He believed allegiance was not owed to a flag alone, but to the ideals the flag claimed to represent. That distinction made him inconvenient, because it meant patriotism could be measured and found lacking. Part 52. The silence that followed courage. After his political career faded, Robert Smalls did not vanish from life. He vanished from conversation. Silence replaced confrontation. That silence was strategic. It allowed America to avoid the discomfort of unfinished justice while still celebrating abstract freedom. Smalls became a footnote when he was mentioned at all, and footnotes rarely inspire accountability. Part 53. What comfort requires. Comfort requires forgetting details. It requires smoothing sharp edges. It requires heroes without demands. It requires stories that end neatly. Robert Smalls's life refused to cooperate. There was no tidy resolution, no triumphant reconciliation, no moment where equality arrived and stayed. Only effort, only resistance, only persistence against retreat. That made him difficult to package and easy to ignore. Part 54. The inheritance of delay. Delay has consequences.
Every right postponed becomes a grievance inherited. Every promise deferred becomes a burden passed forward. Smalls understood this instinctively. That is why he fought so hard during Reconstruction. He knew windows close. When Reconstruction collapsed, he knew the cost would not be paid by his generation alone. History proved him right. Part 55. Why his story is still radical. Robert Smalls does not belong neatly to any ideology. He believed in federal power and local accountability. He believed in law and moral urgency. He believed in patience and action. This complexity resists slogans, and stories that resist slogans rarely go viral until their absence becomes impossible to ignore. Part 56. Memory as a battleground. Memory is not neutral, it is curated. The exclusion of Robert Smalls was not simply neglect, it was a choice repeated across generations because it served stability built on inequality. Remembering him now disrupts that stability. That is why memory becomes a battleground long after wars end. Part 57. The evidence that endures. Ships rot, buildings fall, statues crack, but records endure. Smalls' handwriting in official documents, his name in congressional rolls, his actions in naval logs. These are not interpretations, they are facts, and facts are difficult to erase forever. Part 58. What he never asked for. Robert Smalls never asked to be exceptional. He asked to be equal. Exceptionalism was imposed on him by a system that denied basic rights and then marveled when he overcame that denial. His life challenges the idea that greatness is rare. Sometimes greatness is simply what competence looks like under pressure. Part 59. The quiet continuation. After Smalls, others followed, often not knowingly. Black leaders who believed in institutions, even when institutions betrayed them. Activists who used law as both shield and weapon. Citizens who demanded inclusion rather than separation. They inherited methods, even if they did not inherit names. That is how legacy often works. Part 60. The uncomfortable question. Robert Smalls' life leaves one question unresolved. If America knew then what it claims to know now, why did it wait so long to act? That question has no historical boundary. It applies to every generation that benefits from delay while promising eventual justice. Part 71. Selective patriotism. Selective patriotism praises sacrifice only when it reinforces comfort. Robert Smalls disrupted that comfort. He did everything patriotism claimed to honor, risked his life, defended the nation, upheld its laws. Yet his loyalty was never fully embraced, because his patriotism demanded reciprocity. He asked the nation to live up to its promises, and selective patriotism has no answer to that demand. Part 72. Education as a gatekeeper. What a nation teaches determines what it tolerates. By excluding Robert Smalls from mainstream education, America narrowed the imagination of what black citizenship could look like. Leadership became an exception. Governance became suspicious. Authority became conditional. Ignorance did not merely forget Smalls, it prepared the ground for future exclusion. Part 73. The danger of a complete story. An incomplete history is easy to defend. A complete one is not. Robert Smalls forces the inclusion of uncomfortable facts. That enslaved people understood power. that they mastered complex systems, that they were denied rights not because of incapacity, but because of threat. A complete story destabilizes hierarchy. That is why it is resisted. Part 74. Why time did not heal this wound. Time heals wounds only when wounds are treated. Robert Smalls's erasure was never addressed, it was layered over. Generation after generation inherited silence, mistaking distance for resolution. Distance only buried the evidence, it did not erase it.